Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the stomach of a legend, Alexander the Great, the man who conquered half the known world before the age of 33, tamed wild horses as a teen, casually founded cities like he was playing ancient SimCity, and still had to decide every morning what to eat for breakfast. Was it roasted lamb in a golden bowl, boiled lentils in a battlefield tent, or just whatever didn't crawl away fast enough? Before we open his royal lunchbox, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing who's watching this at 2 AM while eating cereal straight from the box like a true war general. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before he was Alexander the Great, he was Alexander. Eat your porridge. Long before empire building, world conquest, and being mourned by 3 continents, young Alexander of Macedon started his days like every other noble boy, with a breakfast that was aggressively wholesome and suspiciously hard to chew. Picture a chilly Macedonian morning. The sun's not even up yet, and neither is Aristotle, but the kitchen is alive with the sounds of boiling barley and people pretending it tastes better today. Breakfast for young Alexander likely consisted of boiled barley gruel, which is just a polite way of saying hot, slightly salty mush. Occasionally it might have been elevated with a splash of goat's milk, or, if it was a holiday, a dried fig that looked like it had been through something traumatic. Next to this steaming bowl of mild despair, there would have been bread, probably made of emmer or barley flour, rough in texture and morally opposed to fluffiness. It was the kind of bread that stared back, that held grudges, that doubled as a blunt object in times of political tension. Olives would make an appearance too, because nothing says childhood breakfast like bitter, oily fruit soaked in brine. And if you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean born into a royal bloodline with at least one surviving parent, you might get a wedge of goat cheese, aged to the point of self-defense and capable of clearing your sinuses from across the room. To wash it all down, wine. Yes, even for a kid. But don't get excited. It was heavily diluted, practically purple water. Macedonians believed drinking pure wine was for barbarians and poets with poor judgment. It sounds humble, and it was. But it wasn't because the Macedonian court lacked resources. No, Alexander's father, Philip II, deliberately raised his son in a culture of restraint. No luxury, no softness, just calories, protein, and the psychological conditioning of a man who would one day eat field rations in Persia without blinking. So, no golden pancakes, no royal eggs Benedict, just mush, olives, and bread so dense it could hold up a collapsing column. Breakfast, the first conquest of the day. Imagine sitting down to eat your lunch, and across from you is Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, and full-time buzzkill when it came to overindulgence. You just want to enjoy your barley bread and maybe a fig, and he's over there giving a TED talk on moderation between bites of lentil stew. Alexander, as a teenager, wasn't just learning how to swing a sword. He was trained in ethics, logic, rhetoric, and probably which foods made you too lazy to conquer Asia. Aristotle, being a disciple of Plato and a fan of balance in all things, took personal responsibility for making sure Alexander's body and mind were equally fed, though probably not equally thrilled. Meals were opportunities for character development. If you reached for a second chunk of cheese, Aristotle was likely to raise an eyebrow and casually mention how gluttony dulls the soul and thickens the wits. Fun times. But this wasn't just some uptight food shaming. Aristotle believed food played a central role in shaping leaders. Too little, and you were weak. Too much, and you were decadent. Somewhere in between, you got an empire and a tight core. It's likely Alexander learned the difference between food for fuel and food for vanity during these lessons. Simple legumes like lentils were considered good for the soul, which is impressive, considering they taste like disappointment unless aggressively seasoned. Meanwhile, anything too sweet, spicy, or luxurious was to be treated with suspicion. as if it might corrupt your morals and have you lounging in velvet by sunset. There's even some irony in how food became an educational tool. While most kids were learning the alphabet by scratching letters into wax tablets, Alexander was probably being quizzed on what Hippocrates thought about wine ratios and whether figs stimulated impure thoughts. This dietary philosophy stuck with him, even when Persian cuisine was throwing its best at him. Lamb cooked in pomegranate glaze, rice so fragrant it should have been illegal. Alexander often stuck to the basics. Bread, meat, water, maybe a few olives if things were wild. So no, lunch with Aristotle wasn't fun, but it was formative. Alexander didn't just learn how to conquer cities, he learned how to say no to seconds, and that, in ancient Macedon, was leadership. If you've ever packed a lunch with love, hope, and exactly one slice of stale bread, congratulations. You may already qualify as a Macedonian field cook. The average midday meal in ancient Macedon wasn't about flavour. It was about not fainting in the sun while shouting military slogans. Alexander's daily lunch, especially before his campaigns, would have been modest to the point of austerity. We're talking about a rough chunk of barley or emmer bread, hardened to the consistency of ceramic tile. This was the kind of bread you had to earn the right to chew, preferably with a dagger and a prayer. Accompanying this crunchy cornerstone of the meal were a few local treasures: goat cheese that travelled well but smelled like it wanted to fight you, and onions, which were practically a food group in Macedon. Onions were thought to promote strength and endurance, and, evidently, bad breath diplomacy. You might also get a small pouch of figs or dried dates, depending on the season, and whether the supply caravan hadn't been eaten by wolves. These fruits were the ancient world's version of dessert, chewy, sticky, and with a texture somewhere between leather and regret. For protein, there might be salted or dried meat, typically goat or beef, sometimes boar if they'd just raided someone fancy. It wasn't juicy, it wasn't tender. It was the kind of meat that dared you to choke on it and win. And what did they drink? If they were lucky, diluted wine. If not, lukewarm water from a leather flask, which had spent most of the day marinating in sweat and saddle dust. Refreshing? Technically. It's worth noting that Alexander ate the same food as his soldiers. He didn't send for exotic spices or request grapes peeled by hand. No. He sat in the dirt, tore off a piece of rock-hard bread, and chewed like a man trying to motivate an empire with his jaw strength alone. So when we talk about the Macedonian lunchbox, don't picture a cute bento set. Picture a burlap pouch of calories that hated you just enough to keep you alive. Functional. Brutal. Just like the man himself. Dinner with your father is already a tense affair when you're a teenager. Now imagine your father is King Philip II of Macedon, a man who juggled diplomacy, warfare, and at least 7 wives like it was a competitive sport. Welcome to mealtime at the royal table, where the food was warm and the conversations could lead to exile. Philip's dinners were likely grand by Macedonian standards, but still a far cry from Roman-style gluttony. Think roasted meats, stews thick with lentils, boiled grains, and a jug of wine that had seen things. The man was famously fond of his drink. Historical sources politely call him heavy drinking. That's ancient biographer speak for your dad's drunk again. Alexander, on the other hand, often abstained or drank sparingly. Not because he didn't like wine, but because Philip had a habit of mixing politics with Pinot, and young Alexander was already strategizing around him like a mini-general. Nothing spoils your appetite like watching your dad negotiate a military alliance between bites of charred lamb. And the conversation? Intense. You've got military advisors arguing over borders, poets reciting verses between gulps of stew, and philosophers casually insulting each other in ancient Greek. All while Alexander quietly eats his cheese and plots how to eventually outconquer his father, which he absolutely did, by the way. Occasionally, Philip would bring back exotic ingredients or dishes from other parts of the Greek world, spiced fish, honeyed pastries, or strange herbs that made your tongue tingle. Alexander tried them. He made polite comments. But he always circled back to the basics: bread, meat, wine, solid, predictable, useful for empire building. The emotional side of these dinners? Let's just say therapy wasn't invented yet. Philip was both a role model and a raging migraine in sandals. Their relationship was part love, part gladiator match. At one dinner, Alexander even stormed out after Philip drunkenly insulted him. That's how bad the vibes were. And this was before someone tried to assassinate Philip with a spear. So yes, dinner with Dad was formative. It sharpened Alexander's political instincts, toughened his resolve, and probably gave him a lifelong preference for quiet meals with fewer stabbing risks. Now let's talk about Alexander on the road. Not just any road, but the kind that stretches through scorching deserts, snow-bitten passes, and occasionally over the burning remains of your enemies. What's for lunch on this scenic route? A delightful serving of desperation with a side of tactical nutrition. Field rations in Alexander's army weren't made for flavour. They were made for survival, mobility, and ideally not killing you mid-march. Picture a linen pouch filled with barley bread, onions, and dried meat. Ingredients that were travel-friendly, immortal, and borderline spiteful in texture. The bread? Dense, hard, unflavoured. If you could chew through it without breaking a tooth, congratulations, you were fit for service. These loaves doubled as utensils, shields, and in extreme cases, emotional support objects. Reheated over a campfire, they could almost pass as edible. Cold, you'd sooner bite a rock. Meat, if available, was salted beyond recognition. Goat, lamb, or beef sliced thin, left to dry in the sun, and salted until it became more mineral than muscle. This wasn't jerky. This was ancient dental testing material. It kept well, though, and if you soaked it long enough in water or wine, it might even bend. Onions and garlic were constant companions, not because they were fun, but because they were cheap, pungent, and believed to boost stamina. Nothing says I'm ready for battle like breath so intense it clears a phalanx. For hydration there was diluted wine, not enough to get drunk, but just enough to make the water taste less like saddle leather and regret. Straight water was rarely safe, especially when you were 700 miles into Persia, and the local streams were busy being cursed. There were exceptions. Occasionally, after a victory, Alexander allowed a feast: roast animals, flatbreads with herbs, wine that didn't taste like boiled sandals. But those were rare, and always followed by another brutal march. It was never luxury for luxury's sake. It was reward with a return to reality baked in. So, yes, field rations weren't gourmet, but they kept you alive, alert, and just angry enough to take on the next empire. And Alexander, he ate the same thing. Not because he had to, but because he believed no man deserved better food than his army. Picture this. You've been marching for days through blistering heat. Your sandals are basically leather regrets, and your throat feels like it's been personally cursed by the sun god Helios. Suddenly, a soldier finds a meagre puddle. Not a spring, not a stream, just a muddy, probably frog-adjacent puddle, and scoops the water into his helmet. Now here comes the historical part. That soldier offers it to Alexander, the King of Kings, slayer of Persian armies, conqueror of worlds. And he just looks at the water, thanks the man, and then pours it onto the ground in front of everyone. It's one of the most iconic and dramatically parched moments of Alexander's life. Not because of what he drank, but because of what he didn't. But let's pause. Why a helmet? Because in the ancient world, cookware was optional, but helmets were standard. It was your drinking cup, your bowl, your head shield, your emergency chamber pot, multifunctional, efficient, slightly unsanitary. Alexander's gesture wasn't about hydration. It was performance art with morale as the target. If he, the most powerful man alive, wasn't going to drink until everyone had water, then you, the foot soldier with sunburn and trench foot, could hold out too. Was the water safe? Probably not. Ancient armies didn't exactly have Brita filters, but that wasn't the point. In one smooth motion, Alexander turned dehydration into team building. It's like a corporate trust fall, but dustier and with more sandals. And the legend stuck. Writers like Arrian and Plutarch couldn't get enough of it. Because here was a man who didn't just lead by strategy, he led by staged suffering. He was hungry when they were. He walked when they did. And when the only water available looked like it came from a donkey hoofprint, he still refused to drink before his men. It's honestly genius. Anyone can share a feast, but not drinking with someone. That's emotional warfare. So the next time you sip bottled water and complain that it's not cold, remember, Alexander once looked at a helmet of lukewarm frog soup and said, "No thanks, I'll wait." And his army loved him for it. Conquering an empire has its perks. One of them, food upgrades. When Alexander marched into Persia, he wasn't just greeted by trembling nobles and abandoned palaces. He was greeted by banquets so rich they made Macedonian bread look like gravel in a napkin. Persian cuisine didn't mess around. These were the people who gave the world rice pilaf, saffron, stewed lamb with pomegranate reduction, and about 47 types of sweet that all sounded vaguely like honey brick. Their royal banquets were architectural: gold dishes, crystal pitchers, exotic fruits stacked like pyramids, and enough roasted meats to spook a small forest. And then there's Alexander, king of khaki porridge and philosophical restraint, walking into this culinary fever dream. It was like putting a Spartan in a Whole Foods. Did he indulge? Sometimes. He wasn't made of stone. Sources say he did try the saffron rice, the date-filled pastries, and the wine so strong it needed its own map. But overall, he kept his diet surprisingly modest. He still preferred bread, meat, and water over any jewelled stew or gold-dusted fig. This wasn't just personal preference. It was a statement. To Alexander, overindulgence meant softness, and softness, in his worldview, led to losing empires. So while Persian nobles reclined on silk cushions biting into stuffed quail, Alexander was still chewing on his trusty barley biscuit, likely wishing it had a bit more existential resolve. He did, however, let his men enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat, they deserved a night or 12 of gluttony. Roast lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all served on dishes so ornate they probably had their own inheritance plan. But Alexander? He stayed cautious. He'd seen what happened to leaders who let luxury dig in too deep. A soft belly made a poor shield on the battlefield. That said, he wasn't completely immune. A few Persian ingredients, like rosewater and cinnamon, reportedly made their way into his meals. Flavour, after all, was not treason. So yes, Persia sent a buffet, and Alexander sampled it. But in the end, he still dined like a man with deserts to cross, enemies to chase, and a deep distrust of anything that sparkled on a plate. Alexander never actually sat down to dinner with Darius III, but he definitely sat down to dinner because of him. After chasing the Persian king across Asia, like the world's most determined food delivery guy, Alexander eventually inherited more than just his throne. He inherited his entire dining setup. We're talking about a royal kitchen operation on steroids. Darius didn't travel with a few cooks and a pot. He travelled with hundreds of chefs, bakers, spice handlers, and professional food testers whose job was essentially, eat this in case it kills the king. It was less of a camp and more of a Michelin-starred military convoy. When Darius fled and left the dining tent behind, Alexander entered a world of decadence previously reserved for immortals and people with very fragile egos. Gold-plated dishes, tables groaning under slow-roasted lamb, saffron rice, grilled fish wrapped in fig leaves, and sauces that had been aged longer than most Macedonian soldiers. How did Alexander react? Well, like a man raised on onions and skepticism. He sat bolt upright, reportedly ignored the couches, and ate quietly while everyone around him reclined and tried not to make eye contact with the extremely intense conqueror. No slouching, no lounging. Just chewing with purpose and possibly judgment. This wasn't rudeness, it was intentional signalling. Alexander wasn't about to get caught playing Persian prince cosplay. He wanted everyone, especially former Persian nobles now awkwardly handing him their loyalty, to know he was still Macedonian, still disciplined, and still very capable of kicking over the table if things got too soft. But let's not pretend he didn't enjoy the variety. Sources mention that Alexander adopted some Persian dining customs, like multi-course meals and the occasional floral-scented wine. He wasn't above appreciating good food, he was just above needing it. So no, he didn't dine with Darius in the traditional sense, but he dined in Darius's seat, with Darius's silverware, surrounded by Darius's terrified chefs, which, in a way, was even more satisfying. After all, revenge is a dish best served on a gold platter, with a side of roasted goat and political domination. Alexander the Great was famous for a lot of things: tactical brilliance, unstoppable ambition, world domination before the age of 33. But tonight's menu? Wine. So much wine. Enough wine to make Dionysus say, "Hey, maybe pace yourself." Despite his usual restraint, there were moments, rare, theatrical, and slightly tragic, when Alexander leaned fully into the goblet. The most infamous of these took place in Persia, when the conquering hero, surrounded by luxury and a lot of people who nodded too quickly, hosted a massive, flamingly indulgent banquet. What was served? Likely an overwhelming spread of Persian delicacies: roasted lamb, rice pilafs, spiced fruits, date syrups, and wine poured like it owed someone money. There were toasts, long ones, emotional ones, possibly ones that involved dramatic recitations of Homer and crying about Achilles. Then came the incident. After many rounds of increasingly blurry diplomacy, Alexander, reportedly sloshed but still regal, decided to burn down the royal palace at Persepolis. Why? Historians still argue. Some say it was symbolic, others say it was revenge. A few suspect it was a drunk dare egged on by his equally plastered companions. You know how it goes. A little too much fermented grape juice and suddenly you're torching a world wonder. Alexander woke up with the ancient equivalent of a hangover and a slightly charred empire. It may be the first recorded moment of post-wine regret in military history. This wasn't an isolated case of tipsy leadership. Other stories mention fights breaking out after banquets, including one tragic evening when Alexander, in a drunken rage, killed his close friend Clytus, the same man who had once saved his life in battle. That particular night ended with vomiting, tears, and a crisis of existential proportions. Just your average Friday in Babylon. The takeaway? For a man so obsessed with control, alcohol was his one blind spot. And the more success he had, the harder it was to keep the wine and the yes-men from overflowing. So, yes, Alexander drank. Occasionally too much. And when he did, he wasn't a king or a god. He was just a very drunk man with a very bad sense of scale. And unfortunately access to tortures. Marching into India was not just a geopolitical maneuver. It was a culinary curveball for Alexander and his exhausted, flatbread-fed troops. They had crossed scorching deserts, trudged through freezing mountain passes, and now, here they were, face to face with spices they couldn't pronounce and animals that looked like siege towers with tusks. Food-wise, India was a revelation. This was a land of lentils, rice, ginger, turmeric, tamarind, and enough chilly-adjacent heat to turn a Macedonian soldier's helmet into a steam room. Ancient sources, albeit vague and vaguely dazzled, describe how the army encountered entirely new flavours: curries, fragrant stews, and vegetables that weren't just boiled until emotional. Alexander reportedly welcomed it. Despite his taste for simplicity, he was curious, adaptable, and just self-aware enough to know that you don't insult local cuisine while you're still technically invading. He tried their food, he respected their traditions. He did not, however, learn to cook. That remained strictly someone else's problem. His men, on the other hand, did not adjust as gracefully. Macedonian soldiers were built for meat, bread, and grumpiness. Spiced lentils and strange fruits were met with suspicion, or, in some cases, public complaint loud enough to scare the elephants. Rumour has it, many soldiers began missing good old barley stew. That is, if you can call barley stew good. Then came the elephants. Not as dinner, mind you, as battlefield opponents. Alexander, always the pragmatist, probably took one look at a war elephant and said, "Okay, we're not eating that, but we're definitely hiring a few." Still, Indian hospitality came with tables full of richly flavoured dishes, goat simmered in spices, fried doughs, date desserts. Even if Alexander stuck to small portions, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming generosity. In fact, some reports claim he sent food back to his troops as a morale booster, which is ancient general speak for, "Here, try this and stop crying." Ultimately, India expanded more than just the empire's borders. It expanded their taste buds, their spice tolerance, and their emergency bathroom planning. And for a man who had once considered a salted onion lunch, this was growth. You can conquer Persia, march through Egypt, cross into India, and dine with kings, but eventually, the lentil always finds you. For Alexander, no matter how far he wandered, or how many golden feasts were laid before him, he kept circling back to the culinary equivalent of a shrug: boiled lentils. Humble, unpretentious, and textured somewhere between mushy gravel and warm scepticism, lentils were his dietary North Star. Now, was this because he loved lentils? Probably not. No child dreams of one day ruling the world while munching on lukewarm legumes. But lentils were practical, nutritious and, most importantly, politically neutral. They didn't scream luxury, didn't stir envy, and didn't cause diplomatic incidents. They were just there, like sandals, or your most loyal but boring advisor. In a world of exotic foods and dangerous banquets, lentils were safe. They didn't come from suspicious sources, they didn't require translation, and they certainly didn't lead to palace arson. See Wine, Chapter 9. For a ruler who slept with a dagger under his pillow, this was ideal cuisine. Historically, lentils had long been a staple in the Greek and Macedonian diet. High in protein, easy to store, and cookable with just a pot, fire, and low expectations. Add a little vinegar or oil, maybe some crushed garlic if you're feeling fancy, and voila, the ancient version of "I'm too tired to cook." Some sources suggest that even in Babylon, with access to every spice, roast, and delicacy imaginable, Alexander still requested simple meals. And lentils, of course, made the shortlist. It wasn't a punishment. It was philosophy. A nod to discipline. And maybe a subtle flex. I could eat honeyed quail wrapped in gold leaf, but I choose mushy brown pulses. It's also likely that lentils reminded him of home, of training in the Macedonian hills, of dinners with Aristotle where the food came with moral lessons, and of military camps where the only thing consistent was the sound of chewing something slightly tragic. So yes, the lentil returned. Not with a fanfare, but with a quiet plop into a wooden bowl. And Alexander, emperor of half the known world, picked up his spoon and ate. Because even greatness needs fibre. When you think of royal snacks, you might imagine grapes peeled by trembling servants, or delicate pastries served on silver trays, while a harpist plays something emotionally complex in the background. But for Alexander the Great, snacking wasn't quite so cinematic. Most of the time, snacks were consumed while riding horseback, overseeing a siege, or casually redrawing the boundaries of the known world. So convenience was key. Snackability was measured not by flavour, but by whether it could survive being dropped in a saddlebag, stepped on by a horse and still be technically edible. Enter dried figs, olives, roasted chickpeas, nuts, and hunks of aged goat cheese so firm they could double as projectiles. These were the granola bars of the ancient world, compact, rugged, and emotionally indifferent. Dried figs were a favourite. Portable, sticky, and packed with sugar and energy, they gave Alexander a quick burst of stamina, which was handy when you were conquering cities before lunch. Olives were salty, oily, and known to stain your tunic at inopportune diplomatic moments. But hey, electrolytes. Roasted chickpeas, meanwhile, were the popcorn of antiquity. Crunchy, satisfying, and plentiful, though tragically unbuttered. And nuts, especially almonds and walnuts, provided protein, fat, and something to chew on while debating whether to cross another mountain range. Alexander's commanders likely carried similar fare, sometimes wrapped in cloth or stored in small leather pouches. No Tupperware, no airtight bags. Just dust-covered finger food handed around between sword fights. And of course there was always road dust. Not intentionally consumed, but practically unavoidable. Everything had a layer of it: the bread, the meat, the figs. There's a reason ancient armies were lean. They were constantly chewing on sand and pretending it was seasoning. Some accounts even suggest that Alexander, despite having access to finer things, often chose to eat like his soldiers. He didn't want to appear distant or pampered. And snacking on goat cheese while sitting on a rock with your men? That's ancient military relatability 101. So no, royal snacks weren't decadent. They were durable, functional, and flavoured mostly by the environment, which for Alexander tasted like ambition, road grime, and the occasional fig. Every empire has its moments of culinary excess, and Alexander's conquests were no exception. While his daily meals were often practical and ascetic, there were occasional banquets, particularly after victories, where things went weird. Not pass the salt weird. More like, is that a fire-breathing dancer? Weird. Victory feasts were diplomatic theatre meets calorie binge. You'd have Persian nobles trying not to weep into their golden napkins, Macedonian soldiers wondering if honeyed lizard was a joke, and Alexander sitting at the head of it all, attempting to keep things from descending into interpretive wine-fueled warfare. These banquets were filled with roasted animals too large for one table, bowls of pomegranate-drenched rice, pastries shaped like birds, and wine poured by men wearing more jewellery than clothes. There were also live performances, music, poetry, acrobats, possibly an elephant or two doing something symbolic and vaguely threatening. But the real chaos came with the toasts. In Macedonian tradition, drinking wasn't just encouraged, it was practically weaponized. Men would try to out-toast one another in volume of wine, and emotional monologue. It started with, "To Alexander," and ended with someone shouting, "I would die for your sandals," while weeping into a leg of lamb. One of the most famous banquets gone rogue occurred in Samarkand, where Alexander tried to merge Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples feast together as equals. A beautiful idea, a logistical nightmare. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the fact that Persian cuisine included sauces, while Macedonian cuisine considered salt an indulgence. It was bound to end in someone flipping a platter. Sometimes the weirdness was unintentional. Like when Alexander hosted a banquet in a city that had been recently conquered and still smelled like smoke. Or when people brought extravagant tribute dishes, live peacocks, honey-glazed camel, allegedly, or a pudding that required 6 servants and divine patience. These feasts were more than just meals. They were political statements, unity stunts, morale boosters, and occasional lessons in why you don't let the guy from Thrace near the wine amphora. So yes, Alexander could throw a party. But even then, he often ate sparingly, drank carefully, and watched everything like a man who knew history was always taking notes. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he wasn't just a king. He was a global brand, with a diet that now included elements from Greece, Persia, India, and whatever that thing was, they roasted in Bactria. Babylon, of course, rolled out the red carpet. And by red carpet, we mean feasts that made Olympic opening ceremonies look like potlucks. This was the culinary climax of his journey. Babylonian chefs were masters of opulence. They had access to grain-fed lamb, spiced date wine, cooked fruits, and endless sauces, all served with flair, and usually on something gold. Meals came in courses, with music, incense, and the faint scent of either glory or exhaustion. Maybe both. Alexander's table was now a geopolitical event. Sitting beside him, Persian satraps, Indian emissaries, Greek generals, and probably a philosopher or two pretending they weren't deeply uncomfortable with cumin. Yet despite the spectacle, Alexander still ate simply most of the time. He didn't gorge. He didn't drape himself in honey. He kept the old habits: bread, meat, maybe a little wine, even as peacocks stuffed with dates paraded by. One part discipline, one part political messaging. Yes, I rule the world, but I'm still humble enough to chew jerky like a field grunt. And then came the final feast. Accounts vary wildly, as ancient historians weren't exactly known for fact-checking. But most agree Alexander attended a massive banquet, possibly in honour of a god, a friend, or just surviving another Thursday. There was food, there was a lot of wine. And sometime afterward, he fell ill. Was it poisoning? A fever? Malaria? Liver failure from years of high-functioning world domination? We'll never know. What we do know is that for 11 days, Alexander lay bedridden, unable to speak, eat, or rise. The man who'd consumed continents could barely sip water. There's no detailed record of his last meal. It probably wasn't grand. It might have been a cup of wine, or just a damp cloth on his lips. In the end, the conqueror of empires went the way of all mortals, quietly, humbly, and possibly hungry. So ended the feasting. So ended the man. And in Babylon, the banquet tables were cleared, and history took its seat. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that Alexander the Great wandered into the modern world, dusty cape, sword at his side, a little confused by escalators, and found himself standing in line at a food court. What would he order? Let's be clear. Alexander wasn't a man for fluff. He didn't suffer indecision, and he certainly didn't believe in build-your-own bowl. He'd scan the options: fusion tacos, rainbow smoothies, deep-fried everything, and likely settle on something simple, portable, and protein-packed. He'd skip the sugar-crusted trend foods and probably head straight for a lamb gyro, nodding approvingly at the roast meat spinning like a mini war chariot. Barley-based energy bars? Familiar territory. Lentil soup? A nostalgic favourite. Grilled onions? Yes, but only if the smell reminded him of conquest and poor impulse control. Fast food would puzzle him, but military efficiency might win him over. The idea of food being ready in under 2 minutes would have felt like witchcraft in Macedon, though he'd probably want to inspect the kitchen, and possibly conquer it. If forced to deal with a modern menu, he'd have questions. Why is this called a Caesar salad? Was he not stabbed in the forum? Why is this chicken General Tso's? What army did he command? And upon tasting a milkshake, this is delightful. What animal did you milk to get sugar? Health-wise, he'd probably thrive. His original diet, light on carbs, heavy on walking 20 miles before breakfast, was already influencer approved. Paleo. He basically invented it. Keto? That's just campaign season. Yet, even with all this novelty, it's likely Alexander would still crave simplicity. A flatbread, some roasted meat, a cup of wine, mixed, of course, because he wasn't a barbarian. No glittery cupcakes, no avocado toast. Definitely no food served in a mason jar. Why? Because Alexander wasn't just a man of appetite. He was a man of purpose. Food was fuel, a tool. Occasionally a morale booster, but never the main event. So if you ever find yourself debating what to order while feeling deeply indecisive, just ask yourself, would Alexander eat this? Or would he annex it? And suddenly, that lentil wrap might not look so boring after all. In the waning days of the ancient world, when the Mediterranean's greatest minds still gathered beneath colonnades and argued over the nature of the cosmos, a woman named Hypatia stood at the centre of it all. Born around 360 CE in the intellectual melting pot of Alexandria, she was not supposed to lead, not according to the customs of the time. Yet there she was, not just participating in philosophy and science, but excelling in them. Her father, Theon, was a respected mathematician and philosopher associated with the Great Museum of Alexandria, a centre of learning that still echoed the fading legacy of the once mighty library. But while most fathers taught their sons to read and ride, Theon went all in on his daughter. He trained Hypatia in arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and Platonic philosophy. She didn't just memorize theories, she questioned them, debated them, and taught them. By the time she reached adulthood, Hypatia had outpaced her father in both intellect and influence. Her lectures drew students from across the empire, pagans, Christians, skeptics, and zealots alike. She taught openly in the streets and lecture halls, wrapped in her philosopher's cloak, commanding attention not with authority but with clarity. She explained celestial motion, conic sections, and the properties of numbers with such brilliance that people described her as nearly divine. And this was not some cloistered scholar hidden in dusty rooms. Hypatia moved freely through the male-dominated world of late Roman Egypt, offering counsel to city officials and even Roman governors. She embodied the old world, the classical world, one that was slipping fast beneath the tides of religious transformation and imperial instability. But Alexandria was no longer just a city of books. It was also a battleground of faiths, Christianity rising, paganism waning, and politics becoming more dangerous than any equation. Hypatia's fame, her independence, and her status as a symbol of rational classical thought began to stir envy and resentment among those who preferred revelation over reason. Still, in those early years, she was untouchable. Hypatia was the final light of a fading era, a woman revered not because she fit into the world of men, but because she rose far above it. In an age when women were expected to marry, bear children, and stay far from the lecture halls, Hypatia did something profoundly subversive. She chose the life of the mind. And more importantly, Alexandria let her. Sort of. Her presence was radical, but her intellect made it hard to argue with her. Hypatia didn't claw her way into intellectual circles, she was invited. Her mastery of mathematics and astronomy placed her at the forefront of Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement blending the teachings of Plato with elements of mysticism. Think lofty ideas about the soul's journey, the nature of ultimate reality, and the ladder between the material and divine, all delivered with geometric precision. Hypatia's lectures weren't just academic snooze-fests either. Her reputation was magnetic. Students came not just from Alexandria, but from all corners of the empire, eager to sit at her feet. Many of them were upper-class Roman men who, paradoxically, learned about logic and discipline from a woman whom their own societies would have silenced. She taught publicly, not in secret. She rode through the city in her philosopher's cloak, commanding attention in forums and amphitheatres, often giving speeches in front of mixed crowds. It wasn't just her knowledge that captivated. It was her character. Hypatia was famously ascetic, uninterested in wealth or pleasure. She remained unmarried, perhaps deliberately, to maintain her independence and philosophical purity. According to one story, likely apocryphal but still telling, when a student tried to pursue her romantically, she shut him down by flinging a bloody menstrual rag at him and declaring, "This is what you love, young man, not beauty." Point taken. Yet, despite her stoicism, she wasn't cold. Many of her students adored her, not just as a teacher, but as a moral guide. Some went on to become bishops, judges, and governors. In particular, Synesius of Serene, one of her most devoted students, later became a Christian bishop, yet maintained his reverence for Hypatia for life, writing letters to her that read like a combination of fan mail, philosophical inquiry, and spiritual therapy. She wasn't just a scholar. She was the embodiment of Alexandria's ancient soul, scientific, philosophical, tolerant, and dangerously brilliant in a world growing more intolerant by the day. By the time Hypatia reached her intellectual prime, the Library of Alexandria, once the crown jewel of human knowledge, was a ghost of its former self. The original structure had been destroyed in waves of war, neglect, and political chaos. What remained was scattered across the city. Annexes, scrolls stashed in private collections, and a few scholars still clinging to the dream of universal knowledge. Among them, none shone brighter than Hypatia. Though she wasn't the official librarian of what was left, many considered her the de facto heir to that legacy. She edited and preserved important mathematical texts, most notably works by Diophantus and Apollonius. Some scholars believe she even contributed to the design of the astrolabe and the hydrometer, tools crucial to astronomy and measurement. That's right, she wasn't just theorizing about the stars, she was helping build the instruments used to observe them. And then there was her commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, a complex astronomical treatise filled with math-heavy models explaining planetary motion. Most people couldn't even pronounce it, let alone improve it. But Hypatia's revisions made the work more accessible for future generations, ensuring its survival through the ages. Ironically, her edits would become standard in Arabic translations centuries later, long after the Roman world had forgotten her name. But Hypatia wasn't hoarding knowledge. She believed in sharing it, relentlessly. Her classroom was wherever she stood. Whether diagramming parabolas or deconstructing Plato's forms, she never treated science and philosophy as separate domains. To her, they were united. The mind and the cosmos, one vast interconnected system. This belief made her revered, but also vulnerable. Because Alexandria was changing. Christian bishops were gaining power, temples were being converted into churches, and suspicion of pagan knowledge was growing. Hypatia, a philosopher rooted in classical tradition, began to be seen not just as a teacher, but as a threat. A woman who taught astronomy instead of theology, who questioned rather than obeyed, who remained publicly unaffiliated with any religion. It didn't matter that some of her students were Christians, or that she showed no open hostility to the church. What mattered was the symbolism. Hypatia represented the old world, one of reason and inquiry, and in a city that was turning toward dogma, that was more dangerous than any scroll. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was no longer the serene cradle of learning it once aspired to be. It was a pressure cooker of religious fury, political rivalries, and street-level violence. Hypatia, whether she liked it or not, had become more than just a philosopher. She was now a symbol, and symbols tend to attract mobs. The tension in the city was palpable. On one side stood the pagan and intellectual elite, still clinging to the remnants of Greco-Roman culture. On the other, the rising tide of Christianity, no longer a persecuted faith, but now an assertive, politically dominant force. And in the middle were Roman administrators trying to hold the peace with all the effectiveness of a man trying to mop the ocean. The newly appointed Christian Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, was ambitious, influential, and eager to cement the church's authority over the city. His rival was Orestes, the Roman governor, a Christian himself, but politically cautious and somewhat more tolerant of Alexandria's traditional pluralism. The two men loathed each other, and in that boiling cauldron of hostility, Hypatia, unintentionally, became a lightning rod. She had the respect of Orestes, often serving as a trusted advisor, but she remained staunchly neutral in religion, refusing to convert, refused to take sides, and refusing to disappear. That, in a time when neutrality was seen as betrayal, was a problem. The Christian population, particularly its more militant factions, began whispering that Hypatia was the reason Orestes and Cyril were locked in conflict, that she was casting spells, manipulating politics with pagan sorcery, holding Alexandria back from its Christian destiny. It was, of course, nonsense. But when a city is drunk on zeal and blood, nonsense spreads faster than reason. At the same time, a group known as the Parabolani, essentially religious enforcers, or monks with muscles, were gaining influence under Cyril. Originally created to tend to the sick and bury the dead, they increasingly resembled a paramilitary force, enforcing church authority on the streets. And there was Hypatia, brilliant, independent, respected by Roman power, unrepentantly pagan in her worldview, calmly riding her chariot through town like she didn't have a target painted on her back. But in Alexandria's new order, no one stood above the crossfire for long. Cyril of Alexandria did not come to power with meek intentions. Succeeding his uncle Theophilus as bishop in 412 CE, Cyril inherited a church ready to dominate, and he had no interest in being merely a spiritual leader. He was a man who wielded theology like a sword and politics like a dagger. And Alexandria, fragmented by ideology, was the perfect place to wage his campaign. Cyril's mission was twofold: to root out heresy and to assert the supremacy of the church over civil authority, and he wasted no time. He closed Novatian churches, expelled Jews from the city, and expanded his influence over both the pulpit and the street. His sermons didn't just inspire, they mobilized. He knew the power of spectacle, of aligning divine rhetoric with physical force, and the parabolani, that unofficial militant arm of the church, became his boots on the ground. Naturally, this didn't sit well with Orestes, the imperial governor. Though a Christian, Orestes upheld Rome's long-standing policy of religious tolerance. He resisted Cyril's aggressive moves, particularly those that infringed upon civil law. Their relationship went downhill faster than a marble rolling down a temple staircase. Orestes tried diplomacy. He tried containment. What he got in return was violence, when a Christian mob attempted to assassinate him, hurling stones during a public address, and one monk, Ammonius, was arrested and executed for the attack. Cyril hailed him as a martyr. The rift was now an open wound, and caught in this high-stakes power struggle was Hypatia, respected by Orestes, resented by Cyril's followers, and impossible to ignore. She wasn't overtly political, but her intellect and influence made her a threat. Her very existence undermined the idea that wisdom flowed only through the church. A woman, a pagan, an astronomer, and a close advisor to Cyril's greatest political enemy. It didn't matter that Hypatia had no army, no ambition for office. In a city where theology and power were now indistinguishable, neutrality was the most dangerous position of all. And Cyril's silence on the growing whispers against her would prove deafening. Because in Alexandria, when people start pointing fingers at witches, it's only a matter of time before someone lights the fire. By 414 CE, Alexandria had become a city where truth was no longer required for conviction, only suspicion and a crowd. Hypatia, once celebrated across the empire as a philosopher of unmatched brilliance, was now being recast in darker tones by her enemies. Whispers spread like plague that she was a sorceress, that she kept Orestes under her spell, that she was plotting against the church. None of it had any factual basis, but facts were no longer fashionable. Much of the propaganda against Hypatia played on her visibility. She was a public figure, riding in her chariot, teaching in the open, consulting with high officials. That sort of confidence, in a woman, no less, offended the rigid worldview taking root among Alexandria's religious hardliners. To them, Hypatia represented everything that was wrong with the old world. She was female, philosophical, and defiantly unconverted. Rumours claimed she worshipped demons, that she practiced dark arts, that her astrolabes were magical instruments used to bend the will of men. In reality, they were just scientific tools. But science, in an age gripped by religious extremism, can look an awful lot like sorcery to those who don't understand it, or don't want to. One story even accused her of preventing reconciliation between Orestes and Bishop Cyril. The logic was as follows. Hypatia advised Orestes, Orestes opposed Cyril, therefore Hypatia must be the root of the conflict. A tidy little syllogism. Convenient, simple, and lethally wrong. The streets buzzed with unrest. It was no longer a matter of if something would happen to Hypatia, but when and how violently. The parabolani, once caretakers of the poor, had fully transformed into zealots itching for a cause. And the city's Christian majority, already primed to see Hypatia as a dangerous pagan witch, needed only the faintest nod to act. That nod never came publicly from Cyril. He was too careful for that. But his refusal to condemn the rumours, to quell the hysteria, to publicly defend a woman he surely knew was innocent, spoke volumes. Silence, after all, is just another kind of signal. And so the trap closed slowly, invisibly, around Hypatia, not with chains, but with whispers and pointed fingers. The kind of prison you never see until it's too late. It happened in the spring of 415 CE. Hypatia, now in her mid-50s, still rode her chariot through Alexandria's streets, still taught her students, and still dared to exist in defiance of the narrative her enemies had crafted. She likely knew the danger. The glances had turned hostile, the whispers sharper, and the atmosphere thick with menace. But she carried on, a living rebuke to fanaticism. And then one day, they came for her. It wasn't an organised trial or an official execution. It was a mob, frenzied, righteous, and brimming with hate, led by the Parabolani and allegedly stirred by a man named Peter, a reader in the church. They intercepted her in the streets. She was dragged from her chariot, stripped of her clothing, and hauled into a church building. A sacred space turned into a butcher's den. What happened next is difficult to describe without flinching. Contemporary accounts, particularly that of the historian Socrates Scholasticus, say the mob murdered her with roof tiles or oyster shells, flaying the flesh from her bones. Others say they tore her body apart limb by limb. What we do know is that after they killed her, they burned the remains. An extra insult, as if erasing every trace of her existence would somehow make the deed righteous. It was a murder not of policy, but of passion, the kind fueled by ideology, not legality. No trial, no verdict, just execution by rage. Alexandria lost more than a woman that day. It lost its last voice of the classical tradition, its last public philosopher, and arguably its last claim to the cosmopolitan spirit that had once defined it. Orestes was powerless to respond. Cyril? He expressed regret, but distanced himself from any responsibility. There were no arrests, no public inquiry. The silence that had preceded Hypatia's death was followed by more silence, and then, gradually, forgetting. But the damage was done. With Hypatia's death, a symbolic door slammed shut on antiquity's age of reason. It marked the end of Alexandria as an intellectual capital and the beginning of its descent into theological rigidity. Her mutilated body was the final punctuation mark on centuries of slow cultural erosion. A scholar was killed. A world was lost. In the weeks following Hypatia's brutal murder, Alexandria fell eerily quiet. Not because peace had returned, but because something essential had died. The streets still bustled. Churches still rang with chants. Bureaucrats still stamped scrolls. But the soul of the city, that open exchange of thought, that synthesis of Greek philosophy, Roman governance, and Egyptian mysticism, had dimmed forever. There was no justice for Hypatia. No trial, no restitution. Orestes, already weakened, eventually disappeared from the historical record. Some say he left Alexandria, too politically isolated to govern. Others say he was recalled to Rome. Either way, the one man in power who had tried to shield her was gone. And Bishop Cyril? He emerged from the crisis stronger than ever. Though Cyril denied involvement in her death, many saw his silence and rhetoric as tacit approval. He made no effort to punish the killers. He never condemned the act publicly. In time, he was even canonized. Saint Cyril of Alexandria, remembered more for his battles against heresy than the philosopher whose blood had been spilled under his watch. As for Hypatia, her legacy was swiftly buried, not just physically, but intellectually. Her name was scrubbed from many records. Her writings were lost, her teachings attributed to others, her contributions to mathematics and astronomy scattered across history, with faint traces of authorship. In the blink of a historical eye, one of the most brilliant minds of late antiquity was turned into a whisper. But whispers linger. Centuries later, Hypatia's story began to resurface. First in the writings of Renaissance humanists, who saw in her a martyr for reason. Then in Enlightenment salons, where she became a symbol of intellectual freedom suppressed by dogma. By the 19th and 20th centuries, she was elevated once again. The woman philosopher, the last guardian of Alexandria's ancient wisdom, a tragic figure whose death marked the twilight of classical civilization. Still, what we know about Hypatia today comes largely from the accounts of men. Students like Synesius, historians like Socrates Scholasticus, and chroniclers from a later time trying to piece together a shattered mosaic. The woman herself? Her voice was silenced. But her silence became thunder. Despite the centuries of silence, Hypatia refused to be forgotten. Her name, once nearly erased, resurfaced in every age that questioned authority and valued the pursuit of truth. She became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol. Not just of a murdered scholar, but of an idea. That reason must stand its ground, even when the world turns violent. During the Renaissance, thinkers rediscovered her story and held her up as a martyr to ignorance. In the Enlightenment, philosophers and skeptics pointed to Hypatia as proof of what happens when religion crushes inquiry. Voltaire wrote of her with fury, portraying her death as the final nail in the coffin of classical learning. She was cast as a tragic heroine in plays, poems, and later novels. Often exaggerated, yes, but always admired. In modern times, her story has inspired scientists, feminists, and secularists alike. To mathematicians, she's one of the earliest recorded women in the field, a forerunner to those still fighting for representation in STEM today. To women in philosophy, she's an ancient pioneer, one who didn't just participate in intellectual life but helped shape it. And to humanists, she's a stark reminder of how fragile knowledge can be when confronted by fear. But Hypatia's legacy is more than symbolic. Though most of her written work has vanished, scholars suspect her influence remains embedded in the survival of Greek mathematical texts. Her editions and commentaries likely became the versions that filtered into Arabic and later European scholarship. So even in silence, her fingerprints remained on the instruments of learning. There's a profound irony in that. The mob that tore her apart sought to destroy not just the woman, but everything she stood for. And yet, Hypatia endured. Not in temples or churches, but in the minds of generations who refused to let her name vanish. Today, statues bear her likeness, schools carry her name, and thinkers from all walks of life invoke her memory when the world begins to slip into ignorance. She stands not just as the last light of Alexandria, but as a challenge to each of us, to speak clearly, think boldly, and never cower before the mob. Because truth, like Hypatia, may bleed, but it does not break. Beneath a quiet stretch of the Italian Alps, just 30 miles from Turin, lies a secret that defies belief. It's not marked on any old map, nor advertised to tourists. There are no Roman ruins, no medieval cathedrals. Instead, concealed beneath the mountain village of Vidraco, is an immense, hand-carved underground complex, a labyrinth of sacred chambers known as the temples of humankind. And for nearly 2 decades, no one outside a small spiritual community even knew they were there. This isn't some minor cave with a few frescoes. The temples stretch across 5 levels, connected by passageways, spiral staircases, and domes that could rival the architecture of great cathedrals. They are covered in sacred art, mosaics, stained glass, cosmic symbology, and golden altars, all chiseled, painted, and installed by hand. It's as if someone tried to recreate the Sistine Chapel underground, then added Egyptian hieroglyphs, Buddhist mandalas, Mayan glyphs, and galactic maps for good measure. And who built it? Not the Vatican. Not an esoteric order with centuries of tradition. No, it was a relatively unknown spiritual collective calling themselves Damanhur, named after the ancient Egyptian city believed to be the center of Horus worship. Founded in 1975, the group envisioned a society based on harmony, self-sufficiency, and spiritual evolution. The temples were their physical manifestation of that dream, a sacred space meant to realign human consciousness with the universe. Construction began in 1978, spearheaded by Oberto Airaudi, a former insurance broker turned mystic visionary. Without permission, without blueprints, and using only hand tools, Airaudi and his followers burrowed into the rock beneath a private house. They worked at night, used removed soil to landscape the hills, and told no one. It was a kind of spiritual resistance, building in secret what they believed could not be built in public, and they got away with it, for 17 years. No one suspected that behind the unassuming facade of a countryside home, a team of artists, engineers, and believers was carving a subterranean wonder. Not until a disgruntled former member tipped off the authorities in the 1990s, and the Italian police, expecting to find a bunker or tax shelter, came face to face with one of the most astonishing underground structures in modern Europe. The temples of humankind didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the result of a grand, highly unconventional vision born in the mind of a man named Oberto Airaudi, later known to his followers as Falco. In the 1970s, Airaudi wasn't yet a spiritual guru. He worked a fairly ordinary job as an insurance agent in northern Italy. But beneath the surface, he was obsessed with metaphysics, reincarnation, ancient civilizations, and what he called the memory of the cosmos. Airaudi claimed that from a young age he experienced vivid past life memories, not just vague impressions, but detailed visions of lives spent in lost civilizations, including Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He believed these memories weren't fantasies, but blueprints. And one of those blueprints, he said, was for a temple, not metaphorical, but literal. A sanctuary for spiritual awakening, to be hidden underground, and constructed by a community united in purpose. So, in 1975, he gathered a small group of like-minded individuals in the Alpine foothills. They shared his dream of a self-sufficient, spiritually evolved society. The group took the name Damanhur, after the Egyptian city of the same name, believed to be the home of Horus worship and esoteric knowledge. Their mission wasn't to start a new religion, but to build a new kind of society, one that balanced science, art, ecology, and spirituality. Damanhur grew quietly. Members gave up their previous lives to join communal living in the Italian countryside. They practiced meditation, sacred dance, and a made-up language they believed enhanced communication on a subtle level. They developed their own currency. They studied ancient texts and claimed to communicate with trees. To outsiders, it all seemed charming at best, eccentric at worst. But to Airaudi's followers, they were laying the groundwork for a cosmic rebirth. Beneath all of it, though, was the real secret. Construction had already begun. Airaudi claimed he had seen the temple in visions and believed it was his destiny to build it. With picks, hammers, buckets, and unwavering conviction, Damanhurians began excavating, not knowing if they'd ever finish or if they'd be caught. They weren't just digging into stone. They were digging into belief itself. And shaping a sanctuary meant not for the present, but for a future they believed was coming. From the outside, the house at the top of the hill in Vidraco looked utterly ordinary. Just a modest alpine home, perched quietly above the valley. But beneath its floors, behind a secret trapdoor hidden under a carpet, lay the mouth of an ever-growing tunnel. It was here, under cover of night and silence, that the people of Damanhur undertook what can only be described as an architectural miracle, building a sprawling underground temple by hand. Construction began in 1978. There were no cranes, no backhoes, no engineering teams in hard hats, just a handful of people with pickaxes, hammers, and lanterns. They tunneled into solid rock with basic tools, removing the debris bucket by bucket, often working through the night to avoid detection. The excavated earth was quietly distributed across the landscape, used to shape gardens and terraces, leaving no sign that anything was happening below. It was incredibly dangerous. The work wasn't sanctioned. There were no safety codes. A single mistake could have triggered a collapse and buried them alive. But the Damanhurians believed they were protected by faith, destiny, and the guidance of higher intelligences. This wasn't just construction, it was sacred ritual. Every strike of the hammer was a devotional act. Ayaraudi, or Falco, claimed he had already seen the temple in a vision. Every room, every hall, every golden altar. His sketches guided the layout, domes representing different spiritual principles, interconnected by passageways filled with art and light. Each chamber had a function: meditation, healing, energy alignment. The architecture was driven by sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism, not modern utility. Even as more members joined the project, the secrecy held. Families passed down stories of their children growing up playing above the temple floor, completely unaware of what was beneath their feet. Somehow, for nearly 15 years, no neighbour reported strange activities. No curious local stumbled into the wrong doorway. No authority knocked at the door. By the early 1990s, they had carved out an underground space large enough to house several floors of elaborately decorated halls, without a single outsider knowing. It was a feat of human persistence, madness, artistry, or perhaps all three. They weren't just building a temple. They were defying the modern world by proving something ancient could still be born, hidden beneath it. For nearly 17 years, the temples of humankind remained one of the best-kept secrets in modern Europe. But as with all secrets, this one eventually surfaced, not with a whisper, but with a bang. In 1992, a former Damanhur member, bitter over a dispute with the leadership, decided to report the existence of the underground complex to the Italian authorities. He claimed there was an enormous illegal structure buried beneath the Alps, one not registered, not inspected, and definitely not approved. To the government it sounded absurd. An entire temple system, built by a cult, without anyone noticing? Still, officials were obligated to investigate. When police arrived at the site in Vidraco, they expected, at most, an unauthorized basement, or perhaps a small bunker. What they found was beyond anything they had prepared for. Upon entering through the concealed trapdoor, they descended into vast chambers glittering with mosaics, golden altars and stained glass windows, all underground. Marble pillars, vaulted domes, sacred symbology from every known spiritual tradition. The officers were stunned. Some reports say they believed they had discovered a lost civilization. The sheer size and artistry of the temples defied logic. This wasn't just a secret room. This was a multi-level architectural wonder carved out of bedrock, hidden in plain sight. News of the discovery spread quickly, and public reaction was a chaotic mix of fascination, outrage, and bureaucratic panic. The Italian government, initially alarmed, issued an immediate stop-work order and threatened to seal the complex permanently. After all, no permits had been filed, and there were serious concerns about structural safety. But something unexpected happened. Instead of recoiling in fear or ridicule, the public was intrigued. Photos of the chambers, particularly the Hall of Mirrors and the Blue Temple, began circulating in Italian newspapers. People were captivated. Who were these people? How did they build this? And why? Damanhur, now facing extinction or acclaim, chose to open its doors. They invited officials, journalists, even skeptical scientists, to tour the temples. And what they saw was undeniable. Not the work of a cult, but a monumental artistic and spiritual endeavour. In trying to bury their vision, Damanhur had created a marvel. And now the world wanted in. Once the cat was out of the cosmic bag, there was no going back. With the threat of demolition looming, the Damanhur community made a bold choice: complete transparency. Rather than deny or hide their creation, They invited the world inside. It was a calculated risk, but it paid off spectacularly. Journalists, archaeologists, engineers, and even skeptical government officials were escorted down into the mountain to see what had been carved beneath their feet. And what they found was less secret cult lair and more underground Vatican meets Gordy's subconscious. There was the Hall of Mirrors, a massive chamber with mirrored walls, stained glass ceilings, and tiled floors that reflected light like a kaleidoscope of energy. There was the Hall of Earth, shaped like a chalice, dedicated to the feminine principle and ancient earth goddesses. Each temple was designed with precision, not only artistically but energetically, aligned with what the Damanhurians believed were synchronic lines, cosmic pathways of energy crisscrossing the earth. The architecture was built to resonate with these lines, amplifying their effects and turning the space into a kind of spiritual engine. Italian authorities, now facing public fascination and media buzz, had a problem on their hands. Yes, the temples were technically illegal, but demolishing them would mean destroying a modern artistic marvel that had captured the public's imagination. In a rare twist of bureaucratic mercy, the government chose to regulate instead of erase. Rather than shut the complex down, they allowed Damanhur to retain ownership under strict safety and preservation guidelines. Engineers reviewed the structural integrity. Historians catalogued the symbolism. Artists simply stood in awe. By the mid-1990s, the temples of humankind had been transformed from a forbidden mystery into a cultural phenomenon. The group launched guided tours and spiritual retreats. Filmmakers and photographers documented the halls. Critics remained, of course, but curiosity far outweighed condemnation. What had once been hidden was now open to the world. And in a strange reversal, the very secrecy that once protected the temples had become their greatest marketing tool. People didn't just come to see art. They came to stand inside a miracle that wasn't supposed to exist. The mountain had kept its secret. Now, it whispered it to everyone. To the untrained eye, the temples of humankind might seem like an eclectic art project gone off the rails, all colours, symbols, and cosmic flair. But to the Damanhurians, every square inch has purpose. This wasn't just a sacred space, it was a machine for consciousness, a metaphysical tool designed to amplify spiritual energy, awaken latent human potential, and realign humanity with the cosmos. At the core of Damanhur's philosophy is the belief that Earth is crisscrossed by synchronic lines, energetic currents similar to ley lines or acupuncture meridians. These lines, they say, connect powerful sites across the planet: the pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and now the underground temples in Vidraco. The temples were not randomly placed. They were intentionally built at the intersection of these lines, making them, in Damanhurian logic, a sort of interdimensional charging station. Each chamber within the temples reflects a different spiritual concept. The Hall of Water, for instance, is dedicated to past lives and emotional healing. The Hall of Spheres is considered the temple's energetic nucleus, a place intended to communicate with higher intelligences and distant civilizations. No, not metaphorically. The Damanhurians genuinely believe that consciousness exists beyond Earth, and that the temples act as a beacon. It's not just symbolic. The community incorporates sound, geometry, and material resonance into the architecture to activate these energies. Walls are embedded with copper coils. Quartz crystals are positioned to reflect frequencies. Every element, from colours to symbols to materials, is chosen based on how it resonates with human consciousness and planetary harmonics. Visitors often describe strange experiences, feeling waves of energy, hearing unexplained tones, or entering altered states of awareness. Whether placebo or power grid, the temples do seem to have an effect. Even skeptical scientists have noted unusually strong electromagnetic activity in some chambers. But for the Damanhurian faithful, science only confirms what they already know. This is a living temple, one that interacts with intention, emotion, and thought. It is a bridge, not just between Earth and the stars, but between what we are and what we could become. In their eyes, the temples of humankind are not a relic of the past, but a prototype for the future. While the underground temples are the most visually spectacular part of Damanhur, they are only one piece of a much larger spiritual experiment. Above ground, the Federation of Damanhur functions as a kind of intentional micronation, complete with its own constitution, currency, schools, and even timekeeping system. That's right. They use their own calendar, which started in 1975, the year the Federation was founded. In Damanhurian reckoning, we are currently in year 50-something. The community is organized into eco-villages, each with a specific purpose: farming, arts, research, healing, or temple work. Daily life blends the mystical with the mundane. Residents grow their own food, participate in group meditations, and meet for weekly social alchemy sessions, designed to align the individual's spiritual progress with the group's collective evolution. At its peak, Damanhur boasted over 1,000 members from more than 30 countries. Newcomers don't just join casually. They undergo an initiation process and are encouraged to live communally, give up some personal possessions, and contribute their skills to the collective. Professions range from sculptors to software developers. Everyone is expected to contribute to the whole. Education plays a huge role in Damanhurian life. Children are taught not only math and language, but also sacred geometry, ancient mythology, and energy awareness. There's even a Damanhurian university, offering courses in esoteric sciences, spiritual physics, and alternative healing methods. If it sounds like Hogwarts with solar panels, you're not far off. At the philosophical centre of it all is the idea that divinity exists in all things, and that humanity's purpose is to awaken to its role as co-creator with the universe. This means living harmoniously with nature, exploring consciousness, and using creativity as a spiritual tool. To outsiders, the community can seem eccentric, even cult-like, but there's no single deity, no enforced dogma, and no charismatic tyrant. Leadership is democratic, and roles rotate. Members are free to leave, and many do. Critics exist. Some former members cite internal pressures, ideological rigidity, or burnout. But even critics admit it's unlike anything else on Earth. Damanhur isn't just a commune or a spiritual retreat. It's an ongoing social experiment, a place where people try in earnest to live a myth, not just read about one. To walk through the temples of humankind is to enter a universe made of symbols. Every wall, ceiling, and floor is layered with meaning. Mythological, mathematical, cosmological. But Damanhur doesn't see art as mere decoration. Here, art is sacred technology, a tool to awaken the spirit, unlock ancient memory, and communicate with the divine without saying a single word. Their aesthetic is not random. It weaves together Egyptian iconography, Celtic spirals, Hindu deities, and futuristic star maps. One chamber might depict the Eye of Horus, while another features stylized DNA strands or planetary alignments. These are not just pretty patterns, they're intentional codes. Damanhurians believe these symbols speak to the soul's language, bypassing the rational mind and triggering deeper awareness. But why blend so many cultures and traditions? According to their teachings, all myths are fragments of a larger universal truth, stories told in different tongues, pointing to the same cosmic source. The temples aren't claiming to recreate any one religion. Instead, they seek to harmonize them all, not in a bland mashup, but as a deliberate integration of human spiritual history. Then there's the matter of language, or rather, languages. Damanhur developed its own sacred language, called sacred language, not very original but accurate. It consists of thousands of ideograms, each designed to express spiritual concepts that ordinary speech supposedly fails to capture. You'll find these glyphs carved into stone and glass throughout the temples, shimmering in gold leaf, etched into coloured marble, floating above doorways like glowing spells. To the community, these symbols aren't invented. They're remembered. Fulco claimed that this language comes from ancient civilizations predating our recorded history, possibly even from extraterrestrial origins. In other words, the symbols are less created and more recovered, like spiritual fossils of an earlier, wiser age. Visitors often describe the experience of being inside the temples as emotional, even overwhelming. Many cry. Some say they feel a strange sense of familiarity, like they're remembering something long forgotten. And that's exactly the point. The temples aren't designed to explain. They're designed to evoke. Because in Damanhur, truth isn't taught. It's awakened through story, symbol, and the silence between words. The temples of humankind were never meant to be monuments to the past. They were, and still are, a blueprint for the future. Not just a spiritual future, but a cultural one, where architecture, consciousness, and community fuse into something new. While the world above rushes forward with technology and division, the world beneath Vidraco continues to expand slowly, intentionally, one brushstroke at a time. Even today, the temples are not finished. Damanhur considers them a living organism, constantly evolving. New chambers are added. Old ones are renovated. Murals are touched up. New symbols added to reflect the changing energy of the community. Unlike traditional sacred sites frozen in time, the temples of humankind breathe. They grow with the people who built them. In the years since their discovery, Damanhur has expanded its global reach. The Federation now includes centres in other countries, online courses, and a stream of international visitors who come for spiritual retreats, energy healing, or simply curiosity. While some arrive expecting New Age fluff, many leave deeply affected, not necessarily converted, but moved by the sheer ambition of the place. After all, how many communities actually build cathedrals from scratch, underground, in secret? Yet Damanhur isn't without its critics. Skeptics raise eyebrows at some of its claims: past lives, synchronic lines, interstellar communication. Others worry about its cult-like intensity, or the degree of devotion expected from members. But through it all, the Federation has endured, not by isolating itself, but by opening its gates. Today, the temples are a symbol of possibility. What can be created when art, intention, and community come together? They remind us that the great sacred sites of the ancient world, the pyramids, the cathedrals, the ziggurats, weren't just buildings. They were expressions of collective belief. Damanhur dares to ask, why did we stop building like that? And maybe that's the legacy of the temples of humankind. Not their beliefs, but their boldness. In a world obsessed with efficiency and spectacle, a group of ordinary people decided to dig into the earth and make something sacred, by hand, in silence, for the sake of beauty and spirit. It's not just a temple, it's a question carved into stone. What are you creating with your life? Long before satellites orbited Earth or sailors shouted "land ho," human beings were already on the move, tracing coastlines, crossing deserts, and scribbling their ideas of the world into clay, stone, or hide. Travel wasn't just about curiosity, it was about survival. The very first explorers weren't adventurers, they were gatherers and traders, hunters and refugees. But over time, movement became more than necessity. It became strategy, and eventually, it became legacy. The earliest maps weren't grand cartographic masterpieces. They were scratched patterns on cave walls, carvings on bones, or mental images passed down orally. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians etched one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet, not of the world, but of a single region, marked with rivers, towns, and mountains. To them, the earth was a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean, with Babylon, naturally, at the center. It wasn't geographically accurate, but it reflected something even more important: intent. These people wanted to understand their surroundings. They wanted to navigate. But how do you travel without roads, signage, or star charts? You watch the sun. You study the stars. You memorize the terrain, the migration of animals, the direction of the wind. And if you're lucky, you pass that knowledge to someone who remembers it better than you. Ancient Polynesians, for instance, mastered navigation using ocean swells, bird flight paths, and the position of constellations. Meanwhile, traders in Mesopotamia followed river routes like the Tigris and Euphrates, turning seasonal floods into shipping lanes. In these early civilizations, travel was rarely solo. It was communal, slow, and often dangerous. Travelers risked bandits, storms, disease, and simply getting lost forever. But they also brought goods, languages, ideas, and technologies across regions. Trade routes began to form like veins across the body of the ancient world. Exploration didn't need to reach new continents to be revolutionary. Sometimes it was enough to reach the next city-state, the next oasis, the next fertile valley. Those tiny steps created the web of interaction that would become civilization itself. So when we speak of ancient exploration, we're not just talking about distant journeys. We're talking about a primal urge to know what lies beyond the horizon and to leave a footprint on the unknown. The ancient Egyptians weren't known for wandering far and wide, but when they did travel, they did so with flair, ritual, and often an armed escort. The Nile was their highway, and it wasn't just for pleasure cruises. Pharaohs dispatched expeditions south to Nubia, east into the Sinai, and even further into mysterious lands like Punt, a semi-mythical kingdom that Egyptians called God's Land. Its location is still debated. Somalia, Eritrea, southern Arabia. No one's quite sure. But what's certain is that the Egyptians sent ships there loaded with goods and prayers, hoping to return with incense, gold, exotic animals, and a sense of divine prestige. One of the most famous recorded expeditions occurred during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, Egypt's formidable female pharaoh. Around 1478 BCE, she launched a voyage to Punt and proudly recorded the journey on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. The carvings depict massive ships, men carrying myrrh trees, and locals with unusual features and elaborate headdresses. This wasn't just trade, it was diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alignment all rolled into one. Egyptians also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula, not just for conquest, but to mine turquoise and copper. These expeditions often involved hundreds of workers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-sponsored and heavily documented. Pharaohs weren't sending lone adventurers, they were deploying logistical machines. Officials recorded everything. What was mined, who participated, and how many offerings were made to the gods to ensure a safe journey. Despite being surrounded by deserts, Egypt wasn't isolated. Caravans moved through the western desert, connecting oases and bringing in goods from as far as Libya. Sea travel, though dangerous, allowed contact with Byblos, Crete, and other eastern Mediterranean ports. But make no mistake, ancient Egyptian travel was not easy. Whether by land or boat, expeditions were slow, risky, and costly. Yet they were seen as essential extensions of divine order. When the pharaoh moved, Egypt moved. And every journey reinforced their worldview, that Egypt was the center of the universe, and everything else, whether friend, foe, or foreign, existed to be known, tamed, or honored. For them, exploration was not rebellion against the gods, it was service to them. If ancient Egypt looked inward toward its river and gods, the Phoenicians were the ones staring out across the sea, and building ships to chase the horizon. Emerging around 1500 BCE from the coastal cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, in present-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians didn't conquer land, they conquered water. And in doing so, they became the ancient world's most daring navigators and traders. They were not an empire in the traditional sense. No vast armies, no towering ziggurats. But they built something arguably more impressive, a network. The Phoenicians established trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to North Africa, to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the mysterious edge of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. Along the way, they founded cities, the most famous being Carthage, which would later rival Rome itself. What made them successful? Boats. Sleek, fast, and durable, Phoenician ships were the marvels of their day. They used a combination of oars and sails, with high hulls for protection and curved designs that cut through waves. These weren't just transport vessels, they were floating marketplaces loaded with cedar wood, glassware, textiles dyed with their famous purple pigment, and alphabetic script carved into stone and traded like high-tech. Yes, the Phoenicians also gave us one of the greatest tools for human connection, the alphabet. Their script simplified writing, moving from cuneiform and hieroglyphs to a system of just 22 characters. It would go on to influence Greek, Latin, and eventually our modern alphabets. But travel for the Phoenicians wasn't without peril. Pirates prowled the waters, storms could crush ships into splinters, and every new harbour brought the risk of unfriendly locals or economic competition. Still they persisted, not as conquerors, but as connectors. They brought tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and spices from Arabia. Some sources, including Herodotus, even claim that Phoenician sailors, under Egyptian sponsorship, circumnavigated Africa as early as the 6th century BCE. That's a bold claim. But if anyone in the ancient world could have pulled off such a feat, it was probably the Phoenicians. They didn't build monuments. They built routes, and in doing so mapped the heart of the ancient world through wind, wave, and trade. While Mediterranean sailors cut across waves and traded city to city, far to the east, another kind of journey was unfolding, slower, dustier, and just as transformative. In ancient China, travel didn't mean ships on the sea. It meant caravans crossing deserts, winding through mountains, and braving some of the most unforgiving terrain on earth. This was the beginning of what we now call the Silk Road, a vast network of overland routes that connected East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Its origins trace back to the Han dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, when the Emperor Wu of Han sent an emissary named Zhang Qian westward to establish alliances against nomadic invaders. Zhang Qian failed in his political mission, but in doing so, he accidentally discovered entire civilizations beyond China's western frontier. He returned years later with stories of Persian goods, Central Asian horses, and exotic cultures. The emperor wasn't thrilled about the delay, but he was fascinated by the possibilities. Trade routes blossomed. Chinese merchants began exporting silk, lacquerware, spices, jade, and porcelain, products so desirable that they became status symbols from India to Rome. In return, caravans brought back horses, glassware, wool, and gold. But it wasn't just goods that travelled. Ideas, technologies, and religions crossed borders. Buddhism moved from India into China. Art styles merged. Instruments were exchanged. Even paper, invented in China, would eventually find its way west, revolutionizing written communication. But Silk Road travel was brutal. Caravans crossed the Taklamakan Desert, nicknamed the place from which no one returns. Sandstorms could bury travellers. Thieves lurked in remote passes, and the sheer distance, thousands of miles from Chang'an, modern Xi'an, to cities like Samarkand or Antioch, could take months or even years. Travellers relied on oases, where small trading cities flourished like green jewels in the desert: Dunhuang, Kashgar, Merv. No single empire controlled the whole road. It was kept alive by a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, each maintaining a piece of the route and taxing what passed through. And yet, despite its complexity, it worked, creating a web of connection that reshaped the ancient world. The Silk Road wasn't a single trail. It was a circulatory system, pumping life, belief, and ambition across continents. While deserts, rivers, and seas posed major obstacles to ancient travellers, the Persian Empire took a different approach. They built roads, long, durable, well-maintained roads, and not just for the sake of moving armies or goods. For the Achaemenid Persians, roads were the infrastructure of empire itself. a way to tie together a patchwork of conquered lands, languages, and cultures into a single coherent system. At the heart of this vision was the Royal Road, commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE. Stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea, this highway connected the empire from east to west, enabling couriers, merchants, and military officers to traverse vast distances at unprecedented speed. Thanks to a system of relay stations with fresh horses and supplies, royal messengers could cover the entire route in just 7 to 9 days, a stunning achievement for the time. For comparison, the average traveller or caravan would take about 3 months. But the road wasn't just fast, it was secure. Patrols, fortifications, and outposts ensured safety for those who travelled under the king's banner. Travellers from across the empire, from Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, used the royal road not only to move goods, but to move ideas, rumours, and politics. In many ways, it became the empire's information superhighway. The Persian Empire's road system extended beyond the royal road, linking cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, and stretching out toward Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Way stations called caravanserais offered rest and supplies for weary merchants and travellers. These structures would later become vital components of Islamic and Silk Road travel centuries down the line. More than just infrastructure, Persian roads symbolized the empire's desire to unite its many parts, not through force alone, but through connection. By standardizing coinage, weights, and languages used for official communication, the Persians made it easier for people to interact, trade, and participate in the imperial economy. In a world where most movement was slow and chaotic, Persia offered something revolutionary: order, structure, and a system designed for long-distance travel. In short, the Persians didn't just rule an empire, they engineered it. The Greeks weren't empire builders in the traditional sense, not early on at least. What they were, however, was incredibly curious. From Herodotus to Pythias, Greek travellers roamed the ancient world seeking knowledge, trade, and sometimes just pure wonder. Exploration for them wasn't always about conquest. It was a way to ask questions, collect stories, and map the unknown. One of the earliest and most fascinating explorers was Pythias of Massalia, modern Marseille, who around 325 BCE sailed beyond the known world, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, and allegedly all the way to a mysterious northern land he called Thule. Many scholars believe he may have reached Iceland or Norway. He described strange phenomena like the midnight sun and frozen seas, things Mediterranean readers thought were mythical. But Pythias wasn't a mythmaker. He was a scientist with a sailor's heart. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers travelled across Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BCE blew the Greek world wide open, creating the Hellenistic era, where Greek became a lingua franca, from Athens to Bactria. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia became crossroads for goods and ideas. Travel was no longer an exception, it was an expectation. Then came the Romans, the engineers of empire. The Romans took travel and paved it, quite literally. With their famous road system, they connected cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. At its peak, the Roman Empire boasted over 250,000 miles of roads, including more than 50,000 miles of stone-paved highways. Roads like the Via Appia, built in 312 BCE, were feats of engineering designed to last, and many of them still exist today. Roman roads served the military first, enabling legions to move rapidly to crush rebellions, but they also enabled commerce, postal services, pilgrimages, and even tourism. Wealthy Romans visited Greek temples, Egyptian pyramids, and spa towns in Gaul. Guidebooks and travel anecdotes became popular reading. To the Romans, travel wasn't just practical, it was a statement. Roads proved the empire's reach. If a road led to your town, it meant you mattered. And with every mile laid in stone, Rome reshaped the ancient world's sense of distance and connection. While land routes like the Silk Road carried caravans through deserts and mountains, another network, just as vast and ancient, stretched across the waters of the Indian Ocean. These were the maritime silk routes, connecting ports from East Africa to India, from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia. Long before the age of sail, sailors were navigating monsoon winds, crossing enormous distances and turning the ocean into a global marketplace. The key to it all? Monsoon winds, predictable seasonal currents that reversed direction each half of the year. Ancient mariners learned to time their journeys with the winds, heading east when they blew in from Africa, and west when they reversed. With this knowledge, ships could reliably cross the open ocean, making voyages that once seemed impossible. Indian merchants sailed from Gujarat and the Tamil coast, exporting spices, textiles, gemstones, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Arab traders from ports like Aden and Oman carried goods to and from the Persian Gulf, while East African merchants in places like Rapta traded ivory and tortoiseshell. Chinese vessels, especially during the Han and later Tang dynasties, also ventured into the mix, exporting silk, ceramics, and lacquerware. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman ships were arriving in Indian ports like Baruch and Muziris, bypassing overland routes entirely. A Roman-era guidebook, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes in detail the bustling trade ports, goods exchanged, and routes followed by sailors across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't speculation. It was a manual for navigating global commerce. But the sea wasn't just a place of trade. It was also a highway for ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia via maritime routes. Islamic traders later carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, shaping entire coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world. Unlike the often militarized overland empires, the Indian Ocean trade network thrived on pluralism and cooperation. Ports became melting pots of language, religion, and cuisine. A Tamil merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni imam, and a Chinese diplomat could all do business in the same harbour. In this ancient sea, the tides didn't just carry ships, they carried civilizations. Not all ancient travel was driven by trade, war, or empire. For millions, the most powerful reason to journey was faith. Sacred sites, holy rivers, and distant shrines drew pilgrims across continents, often at great personal cost, in search of healing, enlightenment, or divine favour. These were not mere vacations. They were spiritual tests, acts of devotion in motion. In ancient India, pilgrimage was central to Hindu and Buddhist life. People travelled to bathe in the sacred Ganges, visit shrines like Varanasi or Bodh Gaya, or climb high into the Himalayas to seek out mountain hermitages. These journeys, often long and perilous, were believed to wash away karma and bring one closer to liberation. Buddhist monks journeyed not just within India, but beyond, spreading their faith along trade routes into Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, and beyond. In Greece, pilgrims flocked to oracles like Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo spoke in riddles believed to reveal divine insight. Others visited healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus, where offerings and rituals were performed in hopes of curing ailments. These sacred journeys doubled as social and economic events, with vendors, entertainers, and civic ceremonies making pilgrimages community affairs. In the Roman Empire, religion was interwoven with state identity. Pilgrimages to temples and imperial cult centres were both acts of piety and political loyalty. Devotees might travel to the temple of Asclepius for healing or make the trek to Jerusalem, then under Roman control, as part of Jewish religious tradition, especially during festivals like Passover. Pilgrimage was also a cornerstone of Zoroastrian and Egyptian traditions. Ancient Persians travelled to fire temples, while Egyptians made sacred journeys along the Nile to participate in temple festivals, such as those at Abydos, believed to be the burial place of Osiris. These sacred travels often blurred the lines between spiritual and political space. Roads were maintained not just for armies or merchants, but for the faithful. Shrines emerged along trade routes, and temples doubled as inns for pilgrims. As a result, pilgrimage helped knit together vast regions with shared belief systems and sacred geographies. Ultimately, these journeys were more than physical. To travel in devotion was to symbolically leave behind one's ego, comforts, and attachments, and return transformed. The body moved across the land, but the soul journeyed far deeper. By the time the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, the foundations of global connectivity had already been laid, not by emperors alone, but by the countless travellers who braved the unknown. Merchants, pilgrims, explorers, and scholars had woven together a vast web of routes, overland and maritime, sacred and commercial, peaceful and perilous. What they left behind was not just footprints, but a legacy of exchange, of goods, ideas, faiths, and technologies that would shape civilizations for centuries. Travel changed everything. The spread of writing systems like the Phoenician alphabet helped standardize communication across borders. Religious movements, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, all owe their global reach to the steady footsteps of wandering teachers and believers. Spices from India flavoured Roman feasts. Chinese silk adorned Parthian kings. African gold crossed the Red Sea and ended up in Persian treasuries. But travel also reshaped how people thought about the world. Ancient geographers like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using little more than sun angles and logic. Strabo and Ptolemy mapped continents using second-hand reports and daring assumptions. Even inaccurate maps were steps towards something larger, a vision of a connected Earth, where distant people were no longer myth, but fellow humans on different roads. These roads, rivers and sea lanes, would eventually evolve into the great trade networks of the medieval and early modern worlds. The Silk Road would merge into Islamic caravan routes. Roman roads would be walked by Christian pilgrims. Indian Ocean sailing knowledge would be inherited by Arab, Chinese, and eventually European navigators. Perhaps most remarkably, the spirit of ancient travel, this urge to reach out beyond the known, endures. The modern world may be powered by engines and GPS, but its heart still beats with the same curiosity that drove Phoenician sailors, Chinese caravanners, and Egyptian emissaries thousands of years ago. They didn't have passports, credit cards, or travel insurance, but they had boldness and vision and an unshakable belief that the world beyond the mountains, the dunes, or the waves mattered, that what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk. And because they believed that, we inherited a world tied together, not just by trade or conquest, but by human movement itself.